there is the potential for a serious outbreak that is both lethal and transmits as quickly as we're seeing COVID-19 transmit. For that reason, if we aren't proactive and prepared leading up to that disease from emerging into society, then we are going to be in a situation like what we're seeing now. This is almost a dress rehearsal for it, and we're not doing a great job. But the point I was trying to make was that we are still better prepared than we've ever been in history. But are we prepared for a future really lethal outbreak? Not even close, and that's what we're learning. So the benefit and what we're gonna gather from this COVID-19 outbreak is where the gaps were, where the weaknesses were, because we really need to figure out exactly what we need to do at the local levels all the way to the global level to accommodate when a real seriously lethal disease breaks out. And we need to be proactive about it. And that's why we have this system in place that is trying to actually prevent a disease from ever emerging. Imagine there's 1.67 million diseases out there that haven't emerged yet because we are so proactive. But again, because you're not hearing about it, it's only when a disease like COVID-19 makes it to human transmission that you have this mass hysteria and this feeling that we are not protected. Ultimately, we are better protected, but we need to be prepared for something far worse in the future.
Wow, so well said. I was feeling better until you got to that 1.6 million diseases part that still haven't, and then I started to feel worse. Tell me about the first thing you said. You said, we've been through these things before, and I'm thinking, well, yes and no, right? We've been through MERS and SARS and Ebola, you mentioned, but Ebola didn't really affect the communities at large the way we're seeing the widespread infection of communities in this country with this.
Right. No, and that's completely fair. We cannot really compare this in that sense. There were unique differences between these various infectious disease outbreaks, but the reality of the risk versus the perception was very much the same. So we allow new things, unfamiliar things that we don't have information about yet, things that impact vulnerable populations. Children usually are any risk that impacts children and the elderly, we prescribe much more risk to, and we overestimate its probability and frequency. We saw that with Ebola. Again, it was the playbook of risk perception. When you check off all these boxes of what brings us fear, then you can predict that people are going to have a non-calibrated reaction, which means we will systematically overreact to something like an Ebola, to something like a SARS, to something like this COVID-19. And unfortunately, the reverse is true too. We systematically underreact to a climate change event. And because we don't perceive that same immediate impact, that same impact to the elderly, that same impact to the children. So it is something that we have seen is really true across any major global risk that has emerged. How do we better calibrate ourselves and our governance so that we are reacting to a way that is proportional to the risk that is posed to the globe? Because we have limited resources. So ultimately, if we aren't really prepared for disease outbreaks like a disease X in the future, then we're doing ourselves a massive disservice. But if we are over allocating resources to diseases or to other risks that don't deserve that amount of time, attention, and also causing unintended consequences and ripple effects, which I am really fearful might be the case with COVID-19, then we lose as a whole. We do not have endless resources here, and we need to be better aligned to the reality of the risks that we're facing.
We're running out of time. I love what you just said, but then you took it to COVID-19, and I'm wondering, really, I mean, if a couple of million people die from this, I mean, and maybe that's the low number, isn't that worthy? And we only have a few seconds left, but I wonder, isn't that worthy of considerable assets going towards something like that as a threat?
So there's no universal answer to that, right? Because risk tolerance and tolerance for exposure varies across cultures, across different ethics, morals, countries, geographic locations. There's so many different views on what is an acceptable amount of exposure and risk for a certain community. We don't have a universal recommendation for social distancing, for containment, for quarantines. We're seeing that in the United States, where you have different communities reacting in different ways. I would argue that this has to be based on the community transmission. How do you define a community, and what is the transmission? Because if it's intense, then yes, you should be putting in the appropriate amount of resources to negate that. But if there is not a sign necessarily of an outbreak or symptoms, then to overreact and to put in too many resources, there are unintended consequences from that overall might increase the risk of that community. That's what we need to be careful of.
Fascinating conversation. I'd love to continue at another time. Dr. Shet Chakraborty, your podcast, you still do the podcast?
Yes, Risky Behavior.
Yeah.
The radio station is closed because out of abundance over caution.
Oh, of course.
But yes,
yeah.
normally every Friday live.
But that's really great. And you have a book coming out too, I think. Don't you? Securing Our Future, How to Thrive on a Rapidly Changing Planet?
Yes, the title is shifting slightly. It's actually talking about overreactions to risk, but I cannot wait to share that with you. Thank you.
Well, we'll have you back then. It was a pleasure to meet you, and thank you.